Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel, and I work as an innovation lead for Microsoft Cloud Services at Formula 5. We are a Microsoft partner specialized in technology modernization using Microsoft Cloud Services. Recently, I released the article about secure DevOps adoption with Formula 5 modular DevSecOps. One of the topics I covered there is related to Azure Landing Zones and modular approach to their implementation, which we also use at Formula 5. This is why I decided to have this conversation about the Azure Landing Zones with Jack Tracey, Senior Cloud Solution Architect from the Customer Architecture and Engineering team. Hello, Jack. How are you, man?
I'm good, thank you, Daniel. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me, Jack, today. And I'm super excited because this is our first meeting. So, Jack, today I would like to talk to you about Azure Landing Zones and specifically when to choose the right one and how to use it with DevOps automation.
Awesome. Yeah, there's lots of options there, lots of flexibility built in. So yeah, be a great discussion.
Great. So, let's start. So, understanding how to operate in the cloud and how to prepare for cloud environment structure is very important, especially in highly regulated industries like financial and insurance, healthcare and life science, or energy. So, this is why Microsoft created Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. So, there are 9 specific steps in this cloud adoption framework provided by Microsoft, and one of them is the most important for today's discussion. So it's readiness to host the workloads that we plan to build or migrate to the cloud. And this is where Azure Landing Zones come to play. Yeah. So I think, Jack, that this is today we will not talk about cloud adoption framework, but Azure Landing Zones are important part of this whole strategy provided by Microsoft.
Yeah, absolutely right. So you may have previously known this as enterprise scale, right? But Azure Landing Zones is its new branding term that we've had for about a year now, something like that. And absolutely, Azure Landing Zones sits in the ready methodology inside of the cloud adoption framework. So it is the reference architecture for your landing zone, hence its name of the Azure Landing Zone inside of the ready pillar. So when you're looking to, set up your platform, you'll find Azure Landing Zones there ready and waiting for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for explanation, Jack. So I think that we can move forward to the next slide. So I think that it's worth to just quickly remind what Azure Landing Zone is. So in this case, Azure Landing Zone is multi-subscription Azure cloud environment for hosting workloads. It enables creating consistent Azure environments utilizing configuration kept as a source code. So in this case, we utilize infrastructure as a code approach. So, Jack, let's stop for a minute here and talk. The one thing that can be confusing for people is the fact that sometimes Azure subscriptions are also called Azure Landing Zones. So, could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And we've done we've done a lot of work recently in the team to make sure that the what is a landing zone page, which is the first page you'll find in the ready methodology about landing zones, to help you explain this, right? And there's really two types of landing zones. So when we're talking about Azure landing zones, we're talking around the management group hierarchy, the policy assignments, the RBAC controls, those sort of things. Think of them as like required resources, like those shared utility services that need to be there for all other workloads to take advantage of. So maybe your hub networking, maybe your shared logging, and all of those sort of things. And the policy helps enforce those things across all of your landing zones, and they're applied at your management group level. When you talk around application landing zones, so we're now talking around things that would live beneath landing zones here in online or corp or in your sandboxes, they're really your workloads, right? They are the where you would migrate your applications into. If you're doing a lift and shift or a data center exit, they would live in those type of landing zones. And there's 3 types of those landing zones, but I know we're going to get onto that a little bit later, so I'll hold for right now. But there is a difference between platform landing zones and application landing zones. And the platform landing zones are more like hosting those shared utility services. So your management your management log analytics workspace, your hub network, firewall, express route gateway, those sort of things. And, you may also have some automation accounts and stuff like that. And potentially in some organizations, your domain controllers, right? You might have Active Directory from an on-premises perspective that you want to bring to the cloud with you. And that would be known as a platform landing zone as well in a separate subscription. Or as you've got depicted in this diagram, you can have those all in one subscription. And that's really a decision that customers need to make. We would always advocate for using our subscription democratization principle. But some customers might think that's a bit too much for them and, can go for just a single subscription for their platform resources. But we'll talk about more subscription democratization a little bit later as well.
Thank you so much, Jack, for this brief explanation. Great. So now let's dive into platform landing zones, Jack. So you mentioned that there are those different platform landing zones, yes, responsible for management, identity, connectivity. So for instance, when we talk about management, we can talk about Azure Log Analytics, Microsoft Sentinel. When it comes to identity, you mentioned domain controllers. So probably it's related to on-premises connection to Active Directory. And on the other side, we have connectivity platform, which is responsible for hosting those services like Azure Virtual Network and stuff like this to connect resources. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the identity one, for some people who are born in the cloud and don't have Active Directory, you may not need an identity subscription, right? You might not have any requirement for it. And again, it's modular, right? So you don't have to have it. You can just say, we don't need it and take it out.
Got it. Okay, great. So you also mentioned that on the other side we have application landing zones, and this is really interesting also. So those are the Azure subscriptions we use to host our workloads in the Azure cloud. Am I correct, Jack? So
yeah, absolutely. These are the things that you would hand out to your development teams, your application owners, all of those things to deploy their services and workloads and resources into that are delivering the services to your business or to your customers if you're an ISV or something like that.
Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So Jack, I think that now there is some time for questions about the landing zones. Obviously, there can be many questions, yeah, but let's focus on some of them. So first question is, do I always need platform landing zones like identity, connectivity, or management? So this is what I hear very often for clients, like, okay, do we really need identity, connectivity, and management as separate landing zones? And what is their purpose and so on? So if you could just explain here a little bit the approach, I would be grateful to avoid confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this comes back to our principles, right? So for Azure Landing Zones, there are 5 design principles that we've based it off of, and I won't list them all, but one of the key ones in there is subscription democratization. Now, what do we mean by subscription democratization? We mean don't put everything in the same subscription. If you think of Azure architectures of 5-7 years ago, you had one subscription maybe for prod, one subscription for dev, and you just put everything in there regardless of whether it's platform, application, whatever. Things have moved on, our guidance has changed, and we're now promoting that a multi-subscription architecture is actually the better approach, because you can treat each subscription as its own identity, right? Its own blast radius. So we can RBAC them differently. We can place them in different management groups and influence the policies that are applied to them. All of those sort of things. So when you come back to this question around, do I always need 3 platform landing zones? I think you need to consider your operating model as a business, and not only your operating model today, but what could it be in the future? Because I think if anybody's worked with Azure and has tried to migrate resources between subscriptions, it can be painful, right? It can sometimes involve downtime and outages. For example, you can't move an express route circuit from 2 subscriptions. You have to reprovision a new one, and the required network changes that go with it. So what we would say is try and go with democratizing as much as possible, because at worst, all you've got to do is grant RBAC on 3 subscriptions for the same person, and they can see and manage that just as they would normally with any of the tools that the portal or Azure CLI or PowerShell or infrastructure as code tools, whatever you're using. Whereas if you suddenly start with a centralized model where you put it in one subscription because the same team do the networking, they do identity, they do the management, And then 3-4 years down the line, you go, actually, we've now got a dedicated network team and we want to make sure that they're the only people that can touch the networking stuff. Yes, you can do that inside of resource groups and carving things up, but it's very easy for somebody to grant a permission by mistake at like a subscription, and therefore you've broken your whole permissions model. So if you actually separate subscriptions, you're just giving yourself that little bit extra blast radius. And also you're not impacting from the whole noisy neighbor scenario where if suddenly somebody deploys a load of things and uses up a lot of quota, that doesn't impact the other services and potentially the other teams that are in there. So you don't have to. We do see a lot of customers who are on the smaller side do a single subscription, but just know that if your plan or aspiration is to grow, we would absolutely promote you use 3 from the start. There is no limitation for you doing that. It's just a tiny little bit more overhead in terms of managing 3 subscriptions instead of 1, but it gives you so much more flexibility in the future.
Thank you so much, Jack, for explanation. So I think that as we now understand that some platform landing zones are optional, I think it's worth to take a look at Azure Landing Zone for small enterprises. So in this case, we do not have to split identity, connectivity, and management resources into separate Azure subscriptions, correct, Jack? So this is optional, as you mentioned. We can do it, and this is somehow recommended, but it also depends on specific requirements and how we operate in the cloud. So we cannot say that putting all the management, identity, and let's say connectivity services under one subscription is the wrong approach.
Correct. It's not the wrong approach, and it's about finding that typical architect answer. It depends, and it really does based on your operating model, as I said. And we do see a number of customers follow the Trey Research architecture that's shown here. But what I would say is if you're right at the beginning of your journey and you've got the option, I would lean towards democratizing rather than centralizing. But absolutely, if you want to put them in the same subscription, it's not wrong. There's nothing unsupported about it. It's just that you may, in the future, when you want to break that out, have a bit more of a painful experience in trying to migrate those services into separate subscriptions. So we're just trying to get you ahead of the curve.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for clarification. So now it's clear, I suppose. So another question, what if I fully operate in the cloud? Yes. So basically, when we talk about the cloud, in most scenarios, our clients utilize some on-premises resources and also utilize Azure Cloud. But in this case, I think it's also worth to ask this question, like, what in the scenario when I fully operate in the cloud? So in this case, for instance, we talk about identity landing zone and we talk about domain controllers. Yes. So in case when we fully migrated to the cloud, or we just have separate environments in the Azure cloud, totally separate from our on-premises resources, do we really need like identity Azure landing zone in this case? Jack, can you say something more about it?
No, not at all. No, I think we spoke about this earlier as well, right?
Exactly.
Like, I don't think you do. Like, no, we don't very often see customers doing that if they are fully born in the cloud. However, some services that you might want to use might require that sort of heritage Active Directory, let's call it that, right? So you may end up wanting to deploy something like Azure Active Directory domain services, so PaaS domain controllers, to give you that Kerberos, LDAP, NTLM style authentication services, even though that's being synced from your Azure Active Directory back into the Azure Active Directory domain services. And in that case, you might want to place that in a identity subscription. But if you are fully, using OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, the new modern authentication protocols, and you just rely on Azure Active Directory or another IDP, no, you don't need an identity subscription or platform services at all.
Exactly. Yes, thank you so much. So Jack, I think it's also worth to mention about separate management groups for each environment to avoid situations when we are locked on the sandbox environment because rules from production landing zone were applied. Yes, so in this case, it's better, because I remember those conversations with many clients, like, can we just use separate subscriptions for different kinds of environments, but under the same management group? So basically, what is I think recommended is this split. So we have management group responsible for managing our online platform application landing zone, and on the other side we have other management groups to, for instance, manage policies for our sandbox landing zone. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Management groups and policy are the heart of Azure Landing Zones. So when we talk around the management groups and the different ones we've got here, you'll first of all see that in your example, we've got the Formula 5 management group, and we would refer to that as the intermediate route management group. So if you follow those typical on-premises principles where you would have like group policy, for example, you would never put group policies assigned to the domain level, right? Because that impacts everything in your Active Directory. You try and leave it fairly untouched and not used. And then you would create different OUs and apply things differently. And it's fairly similar concept here when you think about it in terms of management groups. So in that intermediate route management group with Formula 5, we would create all your policy definitions so they can be used across the whole hierarchy beneath. And also we have assigned some very, very specific policies like activity logs on all subscriptions should be sent to the central workspace, right? That should happen across any subscription within that hierarchy. So we apply that at the Formula 5 level or the intermediate route management group so that everything inherits that by default. And then the reason we use different management groups is to change what must be true each of those subscriptions or application landing zones beneath, right? So for the online subscription in this example, you might want to apply policies that tailor how that must be, like making sure TLS is enabled on 1.2 for all the services, making sure that if a web application firewall is used, it's in the prevent mode and deny mode rather than just audit mode, right? Using the platform and the policies to influence those. But you might not want to have those same restrictions on your sandboxes, right? That might want to be a place for innovation and somebody to just to try something out and completely, you have no rules applied to them or very little rules. The typical rules we would say to apply to sandboxes are you can't VNet peer, you can't deploy express route gateways, so you can't get data exfiltration out, or you're trying to reduce the data exfiltration opportunities. But, we're changing what is true for those landing zones. So if we had one management group and just applied every policy to it, every subscription is applicable to it. And therefore we get into a complex exclusions and exemptions, which is possible, but messy and hard to govern and manage at scale. Hence why we use these different management groups to try and influence what must be true for those management groups. And obviously the inheritance rolls up. So right at the bottom, you can apply these policies at different levels. And then what must be true to the subscription, obviously it inherits all of those things. So it's a resultant policy. The other key thing about assigning policies to your management groups is your application teams should never have access on your management groups to be able to change those policies. So they can't change what must be true for them. They have to comply. So when you think about giving the keys to your application teams, which a lot of businesses sometimes worry about, you can actually go, well, hold on, your central IT team or your platform team or your cloud center of excellence, they're in full control. They're applying what's enforced upon them, and the application teams can't change it. So it's a really, really powerful story about governing subscriptions at scale.
Yes, thank you so much for clarification, Jack, and I fully agree with you. This is really challenging, and also one more aspect I would like to touch here is the aspect connected to dev test production workloads and environments. So. Because this is also the part of cloud adoption framework and recommendations around Azure Landing Zones. So how to handle dev test production environments. So for instance, we can have scenario where we utilize Azure Web Apps, which provides this option to use deployment slots, for instance. Yes, so in this case, maybe we would like to utilize one Azure Web App and utilize two slots, like the QA slot and production slot. But in this case, we're utilizing only one service. So on the other side, the question is, should we have like two separate Azure Web Apps under different subscriptions and resource groups, or should we utilize deployment slots and so on? It's not only about Azure Web Apps here, obviously. It's more about the general approach to separate those different kinds of environments. What are your thoughts here?
It's certainly a hot topic, and it's something that we've actually created some additional content for. And in the FAQ, we talk about this in more detail. But you're right, web app services are a great example of this, because typically what we would say in our default guidance is for most organizations and most application teams, they should have a separate subscription in the same management group per environment. So one for production, one for test, one for development. And they may have a sandbox subscription to try things that are very, very out there that they wouldn't normally try in like a normally regulated environment. But what we don't want to get into is the case of having different management groups for prod, dev, and test and having different policies, because what actually will then happen is what works in dev doesn't work in test, that doesn't work in prod, and you actually slow down that software development lifecycle for your developers. So actually using that sort of Docker mindset, right, where what if it works in dev, if it works on my machine, it should work anywhere. You know, if we apply the same policies and we put the subscriptions in the same management group as production, it's a very consistent message for our application teams along that journey. And they've got the sandbox as sort of a play pit that they can do something different in if they need to try something that's outside of the normal rules. But again, services is a great example, and I'm sure there's other services out there which have certain benefits of doing it inside of a single subscription. And that's something that really is a discussion between the application team and the business at that stage, because they may make a very good reason that it's actually cheaper to run, it's easier for them to manage and operate by having it in a single subscription. But you may have some regulatory controls and bits like that may mandate that you have to use separate subscriptions to isolate the development cycles. It really depends, and it's a horrible answer to say it depends, but it really does come down to a case-by-case basis. But typically, we would see 3 subscriptions or a subscription per environment, per application.
Great. Thank you so much. So Jack, we talk about platform landing zones, but there are also different types of application landing zones. So I think it's time to discuss them right now. So when it comes to application landing zones, they can be categorized in the following way. So they can be centrally managed. There is also technology platform and workload team managed. So I would like to focus on those 3 application landing zones and discuss them a little bit and then start the conversation. So basically, when it comes to centrally managed application landing zone, there is a central IT team that applies controls and platform tools to both the platform and application landing zones. And all landing zones, so subscriptions in this case, are operated by this central IT team. On the other side, there can be technology platform. So many companies right now utilize Azure Kubernetes service, which is often centrally managed. Yes, and applications are running on top of this service, and those applications are managed by application teams specifically. And also the third application landing zone is this type is workload team managed. So entire landing zone, the subscription administration is delegated to application workloads team. And right now, I would like to, Jack, stop a little bit, discuss the differences here. Obviously, I will already explain some of them, but like when I talk to clients, I very often see this this misconception and also questions like, should we use Kubernetes? Will it be better to automate deployment of our applications and like manage application environments? Should we use centralized team that will take care of everything what is happening in our Azure environment? Or should we just care about subscriptions and management groups, but maybe we should delegate the a subscription where resources will be deployed, workloads will be deployed to specific application teams, and they will handle it. So if we could stop for a moment, Jack, and discuss this, I think it would be also beneficial.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question, and it's something we also hear, and hence why these definitions of application landing zones are fairly new. I would say probably within the last 6 months we added these to the landing zone page, because we were getting this from customers quite regularly. I think the key point to come back to here is it relates to the operating model, and that we know that operating models can change over time. So it's important to keep the subscription democratization principle in mind, even if your operating model suggests centralized today. Who's to say it won't be decentralized or enterprise operations tomorrow? So setting yourselves up with different subscriptions from the start helps you achieve that very easily with changing operating models. But I think what we would say here is we don't see customers use one type of these exclusively in their deployments, right? Typically, we might see a company that is maybe on the smaller side that has a central IT team that does everything IT related, from, Active Directory to their networking to Office 365 to deploying applications. That's obviously the centrally managed type, right? And we would see typically those small customers on the smaller side follow that model. But they are always trying and they're always fighting against the business trying to move faster and application teams wanting to do more and have more agility and more freedom. And that's really the other end of the scale, right? Where we've got the workload team managed, where we've literally created an application landing zone subscription, given it to the application team and went, off you go. We know you can't do anything silly because we've controlled that via policies from the management group, from the platform team. And that's where I think that's the target state we want all customers to be thinking and moving towards. Give the freedom to your application teams, enable them to enable value for your business as fast as possible, give them the responsibility for their cost and managing it, security, all of those things. You can control the absolute platform no-nos from, the management groups and policy assignments, and you can always improve on them and add to them as you learn. But that's where we want customers to go. But then we do realize there's this middle ground, right? As you mentioned, some teams have a Kubernetes-like infrastructure team that purely manage the Kubernetes cluster. But the application teams don't want to manage a Kubernetes cluster, but they want to have their application running on Kubernetes. So they will create their containers, their pods, their services, all of those things, but they'll deploy them into a shared cluster that another team manage and operate and feed and water. Another great example of this is the Azure VMware service, right? There might be a VMware team that operate and manage VMware, vSAN, NSX, all of that stuff. But the people putting their workloads in that VMware cluster obviously are just deploying workloads and running virtual machines and appliances there. And again, it's another great example of a technology platform. So there is a bit of a middle ground sometimes, but we really want to be shifting towards the right-hand side and having workload team managed landing zones as much as possible to give the business the freedom and the agility to move fast.
Makes sense. Definitely makes sense. Thank you so much, Jack, for your comments here. Okay, so I think it's time to just discuss a little bit how the whole concept relates to DevOps automation. Because when we talk about Azure Landing Zones, I think it's tightly connected to secure DevOps. And at the beginning, Jack, we mentioned that Azure Landing Zones enable creating consistent Azure environments, utilizing configuration kept as a source code. So we utilize infrastructure as a code approach. So in this case, I think we can truly say that secure DevOps is the core fundamental of Azure Landing Zones. So let's talk more about Azure Landing Zones implementation on the next slide. So Jack, just to clarify, Azure Landing Zones can be implemented using different tools. So it's not only about ARM templates, it's not only about Bicep, it's not only about the Terraform. It's good to know that there are many ways to implement Azure Landing Zones, but what is important in the end is the fact that we can utilize DevOps automation, and this is recommended approach to implement Azure Landing Zones to make sure that the configuration and the state of our cloud infrastructure is stored in a good shape, in a controlled way, and we can, control those deployments and automate everything and keep the history of changes. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely right. And we do realize there will be some customers that infrastructure as code and, CI/CD is very new to them. And that's why we've got lots of accelerators out there to help customers get off the ground. And we've got great partners like yourselves that help customers, move forward with this and take them on that journey. What I would say, though, is it really is the best way of managing your environment at scale, and certainly from that change history perspective, right? So we always know that a lot of businesses want to be able to see who did what, why did it happen, who approved it, all of those things. And really, the CI/CD and the Git side of this enables all of that for our customers. So getting customers comfortable in doing pull requests to make changes to policies or pull requests to change firewall rules on the central hub firewall, all of those things then give you that full audit trail. And also you can build, using things like code owners and approval gates on your pipelines. You can add in those multiple hops of approval saying, well, this person needs to approve this or this team needs to approve this. and you start almost using the tool as part of your service management tooling, so your ITSM tooling, to really give you that scale and flexibility that anybody in the business with access to the repo could create a branch or a fork and clone and create a branch on their own, put a pull request in for a change. That doesn't mean that it's going to apply. The people have still got to approve it. You can run through your various tests and unit tests and whatever else you may build as part of your pipelines. But it really gives you that freedom and flexibility to say, yeah, do you know what, application team, if you need to make a firewall change to the central hub firewall, you can do that. You can put a pull request in to say we want to change this. Somebody in the network team still has to review it, and you're basically saving the network team the work, so they can carry on with their day jobs and their other responsibilities and things they're getting on with. And then as part of their responsibilities, they just need to review some pull requests, and make sure that they're happy with the changes that are being proposed. And if they are, they approve it, and off it goes. The pipeline runs.
Exactly. Thank you so much for clarification, Jack, because I would like to add one more thing to that. Like, if so, this is what I notice. If clients have platforms, DevOps platforms like Azure DevOps or GitHub, they're already, I would say, prepared to start this automation and start utilizing Azure Landing Zones. So it's somehow connected. So if I, for instance, utilize GitHub or Azure DevOps for my current workloads automation, I can still utilize those platforms to implement Azure Landing Zones. So I can pack the code for landing zones utilizing Bicep, Terraform, or any other tool. I can create those different scripts, automation scripts, and then I can utilize those platforms to make those deployments. And here, just one more thing, which is really important to me, is the fact that recently I noticed that when it comes to platform landing zones, I would say it's more mature. Yes, many clients are already onboarded to the cloud, and also they somehow utilize Azure cloud. But on the other side, there is this focus on the application landing zones and this modular approach, Jack. So this is what I, in the end, I would like to just touch a little bit, because I noticed that many clients ask not only about platform landing zones or huge Azure landing zones. They are interested in specific modular approach. Like, guys, can you create just a script to deploy specific application landing zone and prepare everything, because we already have other stuff in Azure cloud. So does it make sense also to you, Jack?
Yeah, absolutely right. And we would say that when you're then going back to your earlier diagram around the cloud adoption framework and the various pillars, we've got one that's called adopt. So you've got your landing zone in place, and now we're moving into that adopt phase, or migrate, as I think it's called
Yes.
here, right? It has various names in different places, but adopt, migrate, same thing, where you've now got your landing zone and your foundation in place to support n number of workloads. That's where we have a number of cloud adoption scenarios, as we call them, where we've got things for, like, here's an accelerator for Azure Virtual Desktop, here's an accelerator for AKS, here's one for APIM, here's one for, I'm trying to think of some others, Azure VMware Service, right? We've got all of these common ones that we see out there that customers looking for patterns for, that you can take. Now, they are built by design, obviously, to fit nicely into an Azure landing zone. But you can take them without as well, right? So if you've already got an environment that, you're trying to move towards as your landing zones, but you've already got something, they can deploy just fine in any other subscription. So you can still take advantage of those. So yeah, there's lots of options there. And I think another key point just to come on to there is, just because the platform team may decide to use infrastructure as code and all of those things to manage the management groups and the policy and the platform landing zones, that doesn't really prevent the application or workload teams using whatever they're more comfortable with. So if they want to start by using the portal, absolutely fine, right? They're still going to be governed and, have the same controls inherited down to them. Then over time, they should definitely move towards infrastructure as code, right? It's going to give them so many benefits, but that's a maturity thing, as over time they would move towards. Also, they don't have, you shouldn't be putting them inside of the same as your DevOps project or repo and Git repo, right? You should have almost like a platform set, and that could be carved up even further between, management, connectivity, identity, and maybe governance. There's lots of options, or it could be one. We quite commonly see it as one and use features like code owners and stuff like that to carve up different approvals. But the application workload team should almost be having a repo per application. Like, this is your application, it's self-contained, go in there. We need to, it's, following that same principle of democratization again, try not to centralize things in the same place, because then it becomes hard to approve changes because people are worried about these monolithic repos that contain everything.
Jack, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to talk to you about Azure Landing Zones and some core concepts.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me along again. Like, really enjoyed the conversation, and we covered a lot of common topics, which I think are important to discuss for all of our customers. So yeah, great conversation.
Absolutely. And please remember to check video description to discover helpful links. And thank you so much, Jack, once again, and talk to you soon.
Cheers, Daniel.